Hello, and thank you so much for joining me for another episode of The Little Princesses by Marion Crawford. We're getting near the end of the book now. We've only got a few chapters to go. But this chapter is amazing because it's so romantic. It's when Elizabeth and Philip fall in love, so be prepared to swoon. Chapter 10, Elizabeth and Philip. Like so many girls who grew up in the war years, Lilibet never had any proper coming out. She just started quietly going to parties from time to time with her personal friends. I tried to encourage Lilibet presently to give little cocktail parties of her own in her own sitting room to return the hospitality of her many friends. I could never get her to do this. She was too accustomed to leaving it to Mummy. Mummy had always done all the entertaining and the habit was hard to break. Then one day, Lilibet came to my room and her eyes were very bright. "Crawfie, someone is coming tonight," she said half shyly. Prince Philip was back from abroad. The three of them had dinner together in Lilibet's sitting room and later romped in the corridor. I noticed suddenly that Lilibet began to take more trouble with her appearance, that it seemed to matter more to her than what she wore at the evening party or play, and I found out that Philip had been there. I noticed that suddenly she began to play her gramophone more than usual and that her favourite tune of the moment was "People Will Say We're in Love" from the musical show Oklahoma. They'd been to the show together. Oh, isn't that so romantic? That's so romantic. They've got a song. Philip, I now liked immensely. It was obvious to all of us that he was very much in love. I think had been ever since they met at that last pantomime and they began writing to each other. In those lonely months at sea, he must have thought of her a great deal, and he must have weighed too his big situation. Although there would be great advantages in such a union, especially for him, there would also be great disadvantages. Philip had been educated at Gordonston, where tactful subjugation had not been part of his training, and there must have been moments when he wondered whether he could possibly face it. But he loved her very much. He was a forthright and completely natural young man, given to say what he thought. There was nothing of the polished courtier about him. He came into the palace like a refreshing sea breeze. I often saw him wandering around in his shirt sleeves. Presently he began to come up as a matter of course and have dinner informally in the old comfortable nursery fashion, in the old nursery which Margaret now used as her sitting room. The food was simplest. Fish, some sort of sweet, and orangeade, as Philip does not smoke and drinks very little. After dinner there would be hijinks in the corridors. Philip removed from the door the old card with nursery on it and substitute another one marked Maggie's Playroom. They would play ball, a good many electric light bulbs suffered, and race about like a bunch of high-spirited children. It was always a threesome, unless I took a hand and did something about it by removing Margaret on some pretext or another. Margaret was fond of Philip in an entirely sisterly fashion, and he was very good for her. He stood no nonsense. She was then at an adolescent's most tiresome stage, apt at times to be comically regal and over-gracious, and Philip wasn't having any of it. She would dilly-dally outside the lift, keeping everyone waiting, until Philip, losing patience, would give her a jolly good push, which settled the question of precedence quite simply. He sounds good for her, he does. A bit like an older brother. One day, Lilibet came back rather excited from visiting a factory, and I hurried to her room to see what was wrong. "Crawfie, it was horrible," she said. "They shouted at me, 'Where's Philip?'" The heart of a princess is shy and as easily hurt as any other young girl's heart. In time, royalty grew accustomed and hardened to this prying into their private lives and made little of it. But not at 19, not in love, deeply and passionately, for the very first time. My first thought when I read that line was Diana, Princess Diana, 19. At least, actually you would think that the Queen would have been very sympathetic to Diana and understood if she'd remembered how she felt. Because, to be fair, the Queen Elizabeth II, then Princess Lilibet, did not have to suffer the paparazzi, the swarms of paps that Diana had, impeding her even walking along the street. She didn't have to suffer that at 19. She just had one person calling out. Diana used to have hordes of them calling out at her. I'm talking about when she was 19. So, it would have been tough. Would have been really tough. It spoiled for them both days that should have been carefree and happy. She began to dread the trips to factories and shops, deeply conscious now of the ever-watchful eye that soon became the over-vocal voice. Older members of the household in touch with the King and Queen were quite bothered about it. If there is not to be engagement, the boy ought not to be around so much. There's too much talk and speculation, one of them said to me. Margaret came to my room one day and fiddled around as she always did, picked something up, put something back, looked at it. And so Crawfie knew she just wanted to ask her something. "Crawfie, do you like Philip?" "Very much," I said. "But he's not English. Would it make a difference?" "He's lived here all his life," I told her. "He's as English as you and I, really." For a long moment she said nothing at all, and then she said very softly, "Poor Lil, nothing of her own, not even a love affair." All this time, Lilibet led a really remarkably quiet life compared with that of her sister Margaret today. Looking back on it, I'm amazed to recall how very discreet and unspoiled she always was. Lilibet had a large collection of snapshots, and the King and Queen never go anywhere without the movie camera. They took films of the babyhood of the princesses and had pictures right up to date. They often were shown after tea at Royal Lodge, and much to our amusement, the King would sometimes reverse the films so that we saw ourselves leaping out of the swimming pool backwards, or the horses or dogs going backwards. One day I saw Lilibet had been busy with her photograph albums, and when I looked to see what she'd been doing, I noticed that she'd stuck for the first time some snapshots of Philip among the family pictures. When it was known that Prince Philip was going to Balmoral that autumn, public excitement and speculation brimmed over. The generally accepted idea was that this was for Prince Philip as a trial trip, a bit like Diana's trial trip to Balmoral. The King and Queen were commonly supposed to have invited Philip up to see whether he would be acceptable to them as a son-in-law, and Crawfie refutes that and says, "Oh, for goodness sake, they've known him since he was a boy. He's a family friend. He was asked up because he was a young man they all liked, who would make an amusing addition to the party. Perhaps also to give Lilibet a good long spell of his company to see how she liked him in large doses." It is good fun to be a princess in a palace, but not always, not all the time. I've often thought how much at Balmoral Lilibet must have envied the Scottish lasses their peaceful courting at evening ends on moor and hillside. Philip's visit dragged on for more than a month. The young people went out with the guns and picnicked together, but they were very seldom alone. Occasionally he would take her out for a drive, and now and again they would manage to get off to the gardens after tea. I was on my holidays at the time, but I heard all about it when I got back, and the general opinion was that both Lilibet and Philip had had a rather bad break, and the summer could not have been much fun for them. Most of the household longed to see her happy in her own way with a man of her own choice. By this time, we were all a little bewildered. I think what really amounted to was that neither the King nor the Queen could make up their minds who was best for their dear daughter, and so postponed their decision. Lilibet was quiet, her brightness suddenly shadowed. The next move was even more unlikely. An official statement was issued from the palace early in September denying the rumour that there was any engagement between the two young people. On top of this came the announcement that Princess Elizabeth and her sister would accompany the King and Queen on their trip to South Africa early in 1947. Prince Philip, everybody noted, was not to be in the party. It was a very quiet and subdued little princess who went about the task of collecting her frocks for the trip. She would be 21 in the spring of that year, but she looked much younger. It was very clear she was not happy about the South Africa trip. Oh, the poor girl. She would have liked to have had matters fixed and to be properly engaged before she went away. She'd probably be terrified that Philip would find someone else in those months and months and months she was away, because she was very definitely a girl in love. Prince Philip was not in London at this time, but he rang her every evening, and he was breathtakingly handsome. I mean, it was conceivable that, he could have fallen in love with somebody else, and indeed he did prior to getting engaged to Lilibet, but he did break it off, obviously. But he was just so good looking, and a lot of aristocrats, daughters were after him. He came to the palace still. Sometimes they would walk in the gardens together. Often he was one of a theatre or dancing group in which other young people, and usually Margaret, would also be present. So again, Crawfie's saying they had very little time alone. Margaret's life, however, held no complications. She was still only a schoolgirl and was about to put her books away for a time and see the world. This was the first occasion on which Margaret was given some real latitude in the choice of her outfits, and so she got some beautiful new clothes made, and she ordered a pink wool coat that was copied far and wide by teenagers of all classes, with a smart little hat with 2 jaunty feathers. The royal family were to sail from Portsmouth on the 1st of February 1947. At one time there had been the idea I might accompany them, and I longed to go. My own romance, still postponed, depressed me, and I thought a change would be wonderful. Oh, poor Crawfie. So the Queen came up and spoke to Crawfie just before they left for this trip, and this is what the Queen said. At one time we thought of taking you with us, Crawfie, but Margaret would have scant time for lessons, and we've decided you must have a well-earned rest while we're away. Do you think, ma'am, I asked, that perhaps the time has come to make a break altogether? Margaret is growing up, and on her return from this trip, I do not feel should take to the schoolroom routine very easily again. Crawfie, don't suggest such a thing. Of course she must go back to her lessons. The Queen looked horrified. I thought Her Majesty did not relish the thought of having to deal alone with what might prove to be a spoilt and disorganised young girl when the party got back. I believe at the time I did not entirely relish the prospect myself. Now, she said after they actually left, how empty and still it was when the cheers from the waiting crowds outside the palace gates had died away and gone. I have wondered since whether the King and Queen thought that maybe a trip abroad and the new sights and adventures to be found would make Lilibet forget about Philip, her first love affair. She was so very young. Isn't it amazing? It was her first love and her final love, like her whole life was spent loving one man. There never had been any doubts in my mind. I knew she wouldn't change. When Lilibet gives her love and affection, she gives it once and for all. She wrote him constantly. Her letters were sent back to him in the royal mail bag. No obstacles were ever put in her way. Oh, well, that's good in that regard. She had Philip's photograph with her on a dressing table or bureau throughout the whole trip, and when her lady-in-waiting asked her whether there was any truth in the stories of a probable engagement, Lilibet told her to wait and see. A picture of them all on the Vanguard leaving England on February shows the King and Queen looking as pleased as Punch at the prospect of 2 weeks' rest at sea. Margaret, obviously very gay and excited, is beside them, and Lilibet is standing at the ship's rail, looking back sadly towards England. About 3 weeks after they left, they descended on England, a winter we shall never none of us forget. Everything from temperatures were lower than any memory of any living man. I remember writing to Margaret and telling her I'd cut my face on an icicle which had formed on my sheet in bed from my own breath. Now that is cold. Food, never good since the war, became alarmingly worse. The cold weather stopped hens laying. Food ships were held up at the dock and lorries could not get along the roads. The country shops emptied because no one could get supplies to them. Trains did not run or took several days in the way. In the worst of the Blitz, we never had to endure anything like the discomfort and cold of those February and March days of 1947. I was in Scotland at the time, and here things were even worse than in England. I wanted to go back to Edinburgh to do some shopping. The journey normally took 3/4 of an hour, but on this day the points on the railway had frozen and the journey took over 2 hours. They were stuck on Forth Bridge. I kept my promise and wrote regularly and fully to the princesses. I gave them accounts of our somewhat macabre existence and the life we were leading. I sent them copies of the Aberdeen papers with pictures of sheep frozen stiff in the fields close to Birk Hall. The letters I got back were a great pleasure to me. They were also a wonderful picture of the different makeup of the two sisters. Margaret wrote with her usual gaiety, all about the fun they were having on the beautiful white train, and how warm the sun was, and how wonderful the food. Lilibet wrote, immensely distressed by all that was going on in England in the bitter weather. It bothered her to feel she was far away, having a good time, in a land so full of everything, and she felt she ought to be at home. So that is a stark relief. Maybe that was some of the resentment the royal family had about Crawfie's book, because let's face it, she was pretty much always presenting Margaret in an unfavourable light in certain passages in the book. It was while the family was away on South Africa that I decided to arrange my own marriage to take place as soon as the royal family returned from South Africa. I did not quite know how I was to break the news to the King and Queen. Well, she tried before they left, didn't she? But they relied on me to take charge of Margaret on their return. I determined to confide to Queen Mary and to ask her advice, so I wrote to her, and the day before the family were to get back, I went to tea at Marlborough House. I was shown into the garden with its neat lawn and pretty well-kept flower beds. I made my deep curtsy and I kissed the Queen's hand, and then she raised me up and kissed me on both cheeks. "Come now, Crawfie, sit down and tell me all about it," said Queen Mary in her kind way, meanwhile spearing for me a muffin on a small silver fork. Her Majesty never touches any food with her fingers. I told her I was very well, and that I'd come to ask her advice as I wanted to get married. Queen Mary's first reaction was a typical one. "My dear child, you can't leave them," she said, shocked. I then told her the whole story, how I'd shelved the matter during the war years, feeling it was my duty then to stay. But I said surely the time had come where I might look to a life of my own. Her Majesty advised me to speak to the Queen when the royal family got back and see what her reactions were. Well, she'd already tried that, hadn't she? "But," added Queen Mary, "I don't see how they could manage without you. I don't think they could spare you just now." Gosh, they came across as rather selfish, didn't they? There is no doubt whatever that African trip was a very great strain on the whole family. For Lilibet it had been a long and anxious separation from the man she loved. It was 4 months since she'd seen Philip. For the King and Queen it meant a great deal of journeying and exhausting work, coming on top of the strain of the war years. And for Margaret it was a trip I considered her neither old enough nor strong enough to undertake at the time. It had been too much for all of them. I was horrified to see how thin Lilibet had got. She almost lost all her pretty colour and looked pale and drawn. But she of all had a sort of inner radiance, doubtless for reasons of her own. The lady-in-waiting told me that as the Vanguard steamed into the harbour, she danced a little jig of sheer delight at being home again. The King and Queen looked positively worn out. I thought at first the King's hair had gone quite grey in his 4 months' absence, but had been bleached by the hot sun. Margaret looked ill and tired out. She looked the worst of them all, and I was secretly very anxious about her. But how gay they all were, and how happy they were to be home. The 2 princesses hugged me and kissed me, and everyone seemed to want to talk to me at once. There was so much to tell, so many things to show. The diamond companies of South Africa had given both the princesses some very fine diamonds, and Margaret had already made little sketches of how she wanted hers made up, and what she would do with 2 very large diamonds left over from the bracelet, which was too big for her. Half your luck. There was a pile of letters waiting for Lilibet, and she soon went off to her own room to read them. I've no doubt to telephone to Philip. It was not only Lilibet's account that I felt in those days worked up and excited. I had my own problem. Presently I sent a note along to the Queen asking her if she would see me on a very urgent and personal matter. I went to Her Majesty's sitting room with a photograph of my husband-to-be under my arm, and I made my usual deep curtsy and then presented the photograph to the Queen. "This, ma'am," I said, "is the urgent personal matter I've come to see you about." The Queen took the photograph from me. She was obviously very surprised and somewhat disconcerted. She asked me his name, and I told her that it was George Buthley and that he came from Aberdeen. She stood for a very long time, saying nothing whatever. I broke this uncomfortable silence presently and told her how at the start of the war I'd wanted very much to marry and had not done so because I felt I had a duty to their Majesties, and I considered it would be most unfair of me to leave the princesses when they needed me the most. But now I said the time has come where I wanted a life of my own. The Queen said gently, "Why, Crawfie, that was a great sacrifice you made." "Does that mean you're going to leave us?" she asked me. "You must see, Crawfie, that it would not be at all convenient just now. A change at this stage for Margaret is not at all desirable." I assured the Queen the last thing George and I wanted to do was upset their Majesties' plans in any way, and for the time being I would be prepared to carry on with my work and live at the palace for as long as they wished me to, even after I was married. "After all, ma'am, it will not be for so much longer that I shall be required here." I waited and hoped perhaps the Queen would confide in me what their intentions were for Lilibet, but she said nothing further. I simply curtsied and withdrew. They don't give a lot, do they? I mean, I guess they allowed her to marry, but it was like she had to stay working for them. I had expected to get Margaret back, a very cross-spoiled and disorganized young person after all her travels and the compliments and grown-up treatment she'd experienced, but quite wrong. She was good as gold. I now concentrated on getting her finished. We did a lot of history and literature and general reading and concentrated on poetry and modern plays. She even tried to organise for Margaret to go to Sir Henry Martin at Eton for advanced history, as Elizabeth had done, but he was a lot older, he wasn't well, so that never happened. And anyway, Margaret's social life became more and more demanding. At last things were moving. Suddenly the look of strain we'd all been conscious of disappeared from Lilibet's eyes. One day she poked her head into my room and looked absolutely radiant. "Crawfie," she said, "something's going to happen at last." "It's about time," was all I could say, and there was a big lump in my throat. "He's coming tonight," she said, and then she kissed me and danced away. Next morning was Wednesday, 9th of July. Lilibet came to my room much earlier than usual. I've never seen her look lovelier than she did on that day, not even on the wedding morning. She wore a deep yellow frock, a shade that had always suited her very well. She closed the door behind her and held out her left hand. Her engagement ring sparkled there. It was a large square diamond with smaller diamonds either side. At that time it was too large for her, and it had to go back to be made smaller. It was a ring they'd chosen together secretly, but of course she'd been unable to do so or try it on. That was a happy day for all of us. The morning papers announced in the court circular that the King had been graciously pleased to give his assent to the betrothal of his beloved daughter to Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten. Philip's naturalisation papers had come through and he dropped the title of Prince. Goodness me, because you have to give up all royal titles when you become naturalised of any country. He was a junior officer now in the Royal Navy and had taken the family name of his uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten, who had been his guardian most of his life and had given him the only home he'd ever known. The romance did something wonderful to the palace. All of a sudden the gloomy corridors seemed lighter and everyone was immensely excited and pleased for the tall, rather unconventional young man who'd been around for some time and had made many friends for himself. He appeared presently, looking very handsome and happy. I congratulated him and said how very glad I was that everything had come right for them at last. He looked down at me and smiled. "I'm so proud of her, Crawfie." "Sir, you have good reason to be, and who should know that better than I?" she added. Photographers, as usual, filled the horizon for a while. All questions of lessons were shelved for the next few days. Margaret was sweet and happy in her sister's happiness as if it had been her own. She was growing out of her one-time objection to Lilibet doing anything she could not do or having a train longer than hers. The air was full of wedding talk and planning, which for me had quite the personal note. That's the end of chapter 10. Oh, wasn't that so romantic? It was just absolutely divine. I loved it. And I love hearing that there was indeed true love between Princess Elizabeth and Philip. And he gave up his princehood for her to be naturalised so he could marry her. It was indeed a great love story, wasn't it? Lovely to hear. I hope you will join me next week for, I think it might be the second last chapter next week. So I hope you will finish this lovely, lovely book with me, The Little Princesses by Marion Crawford. I've left a link in the description box below for everybody that is wanting to catch up with all the previous episodes. I'll leave that for you. You'll see it in the description. See you again very soon, next Friday, actually, at the same time. Bye.